everybody, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from a hometown scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. Today's story, Barnato Diamonds. Hello there. Did you ever hear of Barney Barnato? If you're a reader of Victorian history, you have, because he was one of the fabulous speculators in diamonds who amassed a fortune during the Britain struggle for Africa. And I know you are acquainted with the story of Cecil Rhodes, the man who gave South Africa to England. Now, those two world-shaking characters never came to Grays Harbor, at least not in the flesh and blood sense. But they were much discussed around the harbor back in 1912. They figured prominently in a police court hearing before Judge Tucker and were absent witnesses. And they were named as the most directly responsible for a street fight that lodged 3 men in the Aberdeen City Jail. They prompted a journey from the wilds of Bolivia to the mouth of the Wishkah River, and the story that people connected with them had to do with a box filled to the lid with diamonds. Yes, it was quite a story back in 1912, and one that we'll find out more about in tonight's Hometown Scrapbook. But first, a word from Dick Crombie and our sponsors. It was February 1912 when 3 men lined up before Judge W.H. Tucker in the Aberdeen Police Court. They were charged with fighting in the middle of Hume Street, and they were told one of the strangest stories that the local blotter ever logged. Charlie Swanson and Julius Nelson were 2 of the men, and they pointed to D.W. McCarlin, the 3rd man accusingly, that caused the fight. This was their story. Swanson and Nelson had been prospecting in the mountains of Bolivia when their food was running short. They made a 20-day trip down to the Chilean port of Antofagasta, where they reprovisioned and started back for their camp. A few days out of the Chilean town, they encountered McLaren, who had been wandering in the jungle, lost, weak, and hungry. They too helped him to their camp in the mountains and nursed him back to health, feeding and caring for the middle-aged man. McLaren told his benefactors that he was a seaman. His ship had touched at Antofagasta, and he wanted to see the inland areas and had gone for a hike. He had become lost and wandered in the hills for days. It was a great storyteller, and he spun the yarns for hours of places he had seen and things he had done. And one day he told them of the famous Barnato diamonds. Now, if you remember the early years of this century, you will recall the stories of fabulous buried treasures that made news. One of the most famous caches was the Coco Island gold and the jewel hoard. An expedition was organized on Grays Harbor to search for it, though it never got very far. But if not the most famous locally, certainly the best known of the world over was the famous box of diamonds said to have been hidden by Barney Barnato. McLaren told his friends of the valuable cache, a story that they had already known, and they revealed that he knew where it was located. He told them a long and spirited story of how he had served as a scout for the British during the period before the war broke out in the Transvaal, and how he had on several occasions acted as guide for Barnato. When, shortly after the siege of Kimberley, Barnato had decided to return to England, he had left a box of diamonds with Cecil Rhodes. It was no small box. It was, McLaren recalled, large enough for a man to carry under his arm. It was filled to capacity with the finest diamonds, the finest Barnato diamonds found in the Kimberleys. Barnato had been a suicide at sea, but the gems had remained in possession of Cecil Rhodes. During the siege of Kimberley, McLaren recalled, Rhodes had hidden the diamonds. His death in 1902 had occurred before he had been able to retrieve them. That was the story. But Barnato took his plans for escape. He must be a trusted guide, he told the statesman soldier, and he was certain that he could break through the Boer lines and get back to England. McLaren had been able to fill in every detail and had been a personal scout for Rhodes, he said, and described the British soldier statesman in detail. He had led Rhodes through the Boer line several times during the siege of Kimberley, he related. He told of the 123-day siege of the African town, defended by a battalion of North Lancaster infantry, a battery of garrison artillery, and Cecil Rhodes' own personal horse volunteer. He was everywhere, McLaren storied out, abiding in the battle and held the city for its long and grim siege. And during his service with Rhodes, he learned where the box of diamonds had been secreted. Swanson and Nelson listened intently. It sounded good to them. It might be worth a lot more to prospect in Africa for diamonds than they had already begun to dig, than to prowl around the slopes of the Andes looking for metals that were tucked away somewhere in the mother lode. McLaren convinced them, and they left for the Chilean coast. Now, in a little seaport town of Calizo, Chile, they found the four-masted schooner Encore. She had just arrived from San Francisco and was bound up north for a port of call called Grays Harbor. That exactly suited McLaren, who said that he had a farm near Grays Harbor, and if he could get back there, he would sell the property and use the money to finance their expedition to Africa. The three men signed on the Encore, which sailed from Calizo to Calusa. Nelson and Swanson, the trip back north was hard. McLaren had a relapse and was unable to perform his duties. As a result, they had to work extra hours to make up for his inability to pay his passage. They worked 16 hours a day and saw Washington's coastline with relief, and Grays Harbor was a release from their bondage. And when they came ashore, they immediately began to organize their equipment for the trip to Africa. Meanwhile, McLaren disappeared. He went, as he told the men, to visit his farm. Swanson and Nelson waited for several days, but when McLaren failed to return, they set out to search for him. Though the seamen that they met with in the Grand Saloon, they traced their quarry and found him living with relatives in Aberdeen, and they confronted him with his story. McLaren assured him that it was just a matter of gaining his strength back, that he would be ready to sail as soon as they could find a ship out of Grays Harbor going in the direction of Africa. But while McLaren was telling Nelson of his ailments and reassuring him that all was going to go according to plan, Swanson was asking questions of the rest of the family. Did McLaren know about the Barnato diamonds? Had he been a scout for Lord Roberts during the Boer War? The family seemed a little bit evasive, Swanson thought, and finally, when he pinned one of them down, the young man stated flatly that he didn't think his uncle knew anything about the Barnato diamonds. Yes, he had once been in Africa. Yes, he had often talked about the diamonds, but he had never shown any evidence of having the keys to the whereabouts. When Swanson and Nelson left McLaren, Swanson told of his findings, and that who the two prospectors called McLaren's house next day and asked the adventurer to join them on a buying trip to pick up some essentials for their journey. When they reached Aberdeen's waterfront, they stopped at a bar to talk things over, and although they accused McLaren of duping them, the middle-aged man vowed on his oath that he knew where those diamonds were, and he would soon be recovered enough to take them to the exact spot. But they doubted him. And as they left the saloon, the argument flared up again in the middle of the street. Human F. was the interception. It was Swanson who swung first, knocking McLaren down. But when the African scout got up, Nelson dropped him with a hefty punch. As a crowd began to gather, Aberdeen police moved in to arrest the three and cart them off to jail. Chief of Police Templeman heard the story first. He listened to Swanson and Nelson as they told of being duped by the storyteller, or how they had to carry him from the mountains of Bolivia, worked his passage north to Grace Harbor, and fallen victim to a story of fortune and diamonds. Then McLaren told his story. He stuck to the details so closely that Swanson and Nelson marveled at the accuracy of it, although they had sworn that it was all fake. Chief Templeman had a few questions. For one thing, he wanted to know why, since the Boer War had ended in 1902, 10 years before, why McLaren had waited so long to go back and claim his fortune of diamonds. McLaren replied that he had gone back once, but had been prevented from completing his trip by illness. And now, he told the Aberdeen police and his two confederates, he would return to Africa and find the diamonds, even if he had to go alone. And with that, Chief locked up all three of them for being disorderly and turned the matter over to Judge Tucker. That was how Grace Harbor happened to hear of the story. And when it came in Judge Tucker's court, the press reported it, and McLaren was besieged with offers to finance his trip to Africa and return for a share of the diamond fortune. But somehow, the bottom dropped out of the story. For as nearly as I have discovered, Nelson and Swanson shipped out on a lumber schooner bound for Chile and went back to the hunting ground for gold in the mountains of Bolivia. And McLaren dropped out of sight when he failed to produce evidence to back his claim of the knowledge of the Barnato diamonds. Grace Harbor had a good chuckle while feeling sort of sorry for the two prospectors who had been duped by McLaren, and then forgot all about the whole thing until it turned up here tonight in our hometown scrapbook. And now, here's Dick to say a few words from our sponsor. As one old-timer recalled the other day when we were talking about the strange and colorful stories that began in the hills of Bolivia and ended up in the middle of Hume Street with a free-for-all fight, something like that was always happening in Grace Harbor, and so it was. And he added further, it doesn't seem to happen that way anymore. And then he found reason why things aren't quite so colorful hereabouts, at least as they were in the old days. Grace Harbor, he noted, was one of the most active seaports on the coast, with ships going and coming at a rate of more than 50 a month, many years in succession. There was not an organization among sea rovers then, like there is today. As a result, many adventurers used the sea to get from place to place, jumping about the world and coloring everything they touched. And if they touched two ports on the Pacific coast, chances were good that one of them was Grace Harbor. Here, great stories began or ended, and countless adventures of national importance were connected with men and ships that put into dock here. Finding these stories, recording them, and sharing them with our listeners is the purpose of this, our hometown scrapbook. Thank you for listening.